The day begins with a quiet cityscape, the sky slowly brightening as the sun rises over the horizon. Inside this world, Jaekyung starts his day with a routine. He's seen exercising, pushing through each movement, each rep like it's all part of a plan. Afterward, he steps into his home, eats a solitary dinner, his movements mechanical, as if going through the motions. It's been a month since his injury, and things aren't getting any better. Jaekyung sits in front of the doctor, looking exhausted and frustrated. The doctor informs him that his recovery is taking longer than expected and that he'll need to keep the cast on for a while. The most important thing is rest, and the doctor insists that Jaekyung should hold off on any training for now. Jaekyung slams his car door in frustration. He's losing his mind, feeling hollow inside. He never imagined falling off track like this. After all the hard work defending his champion title, it feels like it was all for nothing. Jaekyung's anger flares up as he blames his downfall on Baek Junmin. Later, in his villa, Jaekyung is sitting on the couch watching the news. The report talks about his injury, criticizing his decision to fight despite his condition. The commentator calls it unprofessional and a reckless move, which stirs Jaekyung's anger. He turns off the TV, muttering that they're full of nonsense. He then checks his phone and sees a headline about his dropping brand value, which only adds to his frustration. In a fit of anger, he throws his phone aside. Jaekyung looks at a bottle of wine. He opens it and starts drinking straight from the bottle. His insomnia worsens, and after trying various remedies, nothing helps. He eventually turns to alcohol to cope, calling it quits. His inner demons torment him, and he hears a harsh voice in his head, reminding him of his failures, how he's always been trash and nothing more. Jaekyung wakes up from a nightmare, his mind in turmoil. His phone rings, snapping him out of it. It's his coach on the line, asking if he's okay and reminding him about a scheduled interview at the gym for a physical therapist position. Despite the rain outside, Jaekyung heads to the gym. Inside the gym, the coach immediately notices Jaekyung's disheveled appearance. He asks if Jaekyung has been drinking, but Jaekyung brushes it off. The coach introduces Jaekyung to one of the candidates for the physical therapist position. The guy talks about his experience, mentioning his time with the National Soccer League. Jaekyung's thoughts drift to Kim Dan, remembering the first day Kim Dan was introduced to the team. Jaekyung's response to the interview seems indifferent. The coach is confused by Jaekyung's sudden change in attitude. He can't believe Jaekyung, who usually cared about these things, now seems so apathetic. The coach wonders if it's the injury, the loss of his match, or the shock that's affecting him so deeply. He hopes Jaekyung's shoulder heals soon, but he can't ignore the growing concern for his well-being. Jaekyung decides to go with the candidate, not wanting to look at more options. The coach comments that it's unfortunate, saying that Kim Dan would have been the perfect fit for the position. Jaekyung reacts strongly, telling the coach not to mention Kim Dan. The mention of Kim Dan seems to trigger something deep inside Jaekyung, and he visibly flinches. Later, Jaekyung, clearly struggling, asks the coach for something to help with his migraines. The coach questions him, asking if he's been to a doctor. Jaekyung brushes it off, saying it's nothing and just asks for the pills. The coach reluctantly agrees. As the rain pours outside, Jaekyung returns home. He lies on the couch, and his mind drifts back to Kim Dan. He sees an image of Kim Dan crying, asking if Jaekyung trusted him. Jaekyung wakes up, disoriented, and angrily demands what Kim Dan wants from him. The chapter begins with Jaekyung still reeling from his decisions and the emotional aftermath of his fallout with Kim Dan. As Jaekyung sits alone in his space, a sense of unease lingers in the air. He can't escape the weight of his actions and the tension he feels about Kim Dan's departure from his life. Jaekyung's thoughts become a swirling mix of self-doubt and regret. He remembers Kim Dan's vulnerable face when he left, the way he looked so hurt and confused. The memory of that moment torments Jaekyung, causing him to question his own harsh actions. The internal conflict is strong. On one hand, Jaekyung tells himself that Kim Dan had no right to betray his trust, especially when it seemed like he wasn't doing his job properly. But on the other hand, he feels the crushing weight of guilt and doubt. Jaekyung cannot understand why this guilt continues to eat away at him. After all, Kim Dan is just another person in his life. Jaekyung tries to push those feelings down, telling himself he's made mistakes, but Kim Dan is just one more face that will fade away, like all the others. To numb these thoughts, Jaekyung goes to a VIP club, trying to drown his emotions with distractions. There, he encounters a young fan who recognizes him. The fan is flirtatious, making suggestive comments and even attempting to kiss him. However, Jaekyung, deeply unsettled, reacts violently, physically pushing the boy away. His rejection isn't just about the fan, but about his deeper turmoil. He's not looking for connection, not in the way the fan expects. Jaekyung storms away from the scene, retreating to a quieter space, the shower, to try and cleanse himself of the thoughts that plague him. In the morning, Jaekyung returns home to find a cleaning crew at his house. As they begin their work, they come across multiple empty wine bottles on the table. Another sign of Jaekyung's attempt to escape his feelings through drinking. The house feels empty, as if it reflects the hollow space in Jaekyung's heart. The crew moves upstairs to clean the guest room, which hasn't been touched in a while. This is where the emotional weight of the chapter starts to build. As the workers tidy up, they find something important. A gift box left behind by Kim Dan. Jaekyung hesitates, but eventually opens it. Inside, he finds a luxury item, a gift that Kim Dan had carefully chosen for his birthday. The box alone would have been enough to make Jaekyung pause, but it's the letter inside that truly hits him. The letter from Kim Dan is emotional and raw. In it, Kim Dan expresses his heartfelt gratitude for everything Jaekyung has done for him. He thanks Jaekyung for making his life easier and giving him the opportunity to breathe again, a powerful sentiment given Kim Dan's struggles. Kim Dan had looked up to Jaekyung, worked under him, and in many ways, had been shaped by their connection. He acknowledges his own imperfection, but promises to work even harder in the future. The letter ends with Kim Dan's wish to continue working alongside Jaekyung for many more years, a testament to his loyalty and gratitude. Jaekyung, overwhelmed by the sincerity of Kim Dan's words, can't help but feel regret for how he treated him. He wonders, what was he going to write after this? He is consumed by the thought that he may have pushed away someone who truly cared for him. Then, as if fate has something else in store, Jaekyung's phone vibrates with a wire transfer notification. It's from Kim Dan, a small payment towards the debt that Jaekyung had helped him pay off earlier. The amount is only $1,500, a fraction of what Kim Dan owes. Jaekyung looks at the transfer with disbelief. He remembers Kim Dan's words, "At the end of each month, I will wire some money towards my debt." Jaekyung, stunned, can't help but feel a mix of confusion and frustration. How's he ever going to pay it all off with this pocket change, he thinks bitterly. The small sum feels like a joke compared to the larger amount he knows Kim Dan owes. Yet, this small gesture shows Kim Dan's commitment, and his desperate attempt to make things right, even if he can't afford much. Jaekyung is left conflicted, torn between the hurt he feels over Kim Dan's departure and the recognition that maybe Kim Dan was never the problem. The chapter ends with Jaekyung once again grappling with his feelings for Kim Dan. He's left wondering what could have been, and whether it's too late to make amends. The chapter opens with a serene view of the ocean and a peaceful small village, setting the tone for the quiet life Kim Dan now leads. We are introduced to Light of Hope Hospices, a modest healthcare facility where Kim Dan, now a physical therapist, is working. Kim Dan's day begins with a conversation in person with a female colleague. She asks if he's had lunch yet and informs him that a patient, Park Jinchul, wants to schedule his therapy session for 2 p.m. Kim Dan agrees, telling her that he'll head straight there. As Kim Dan walks through the hospital, one of the nurses praises his care for the patients. She mentions how well the bedridden patients have progressed under his guidance, despite their weakened muscles. She adds that Kim Dan's skills are exceptional, and he's made a noticeable difference in their recovery. The nurse also notes how handsome he is, commenting that it's rare to find a male physical therapist. Another nurse chimes in, commenting that Kim Dan worked with famous athletes before, which makes it surprising that he's chosen to work at this small-town hospice. Kim Dan's decision to stay here is tied to his grandmother, who lives in this town. The nurses mention that he's here not for a career, but because of his deep connection to his grandmother. Despite his talent and impressive resume, Kim Dan has opted for a quieter life to care for her. Later, Kim Dan goes to see his grandmother, who is having a pleasant conversation with another elderly patient. Her face lights up as she laughs, and Kim Dan watches her with a soft smile, reflecting on how well she's doing. This peaceful moment contrasts with a memory of a doctor's visit, where it was revealed that chemotherapy was no longer an option for his grandmother. The doctor had shared that while her cancer was progressing slowly, she was finding peace after stopping treatment, and her quality of life had actually improved since coming to this hospice. Kim Dan feels a bittersweet sense of relief as he watches his grandmother's brightened face. That night, Kim Dan stays by his grandmother's bedside. She notices he looks tired and pale and urges him to get some rest. But Kim Dan insists he'll stay until she falls asleep. She expresses concern about him being far from Seoul, but Kim Dan reassures her, saying that he prefers being here, with her. He adjusts the covers for her and comforts her as she drifts off to sleep. As he watches her, Kim Dan reflects on his own feelings of loneliness and fear, but he suppresses it, choosing to stay strong for his grandmother. Meanwhile, Jaekyung is driving through the streets, lost in thought. He recalls the first time he met Kim Dan, how the man was shaking like a leaf and seemed so vulnerable. Jaekyung was intrigued by that vulnerability, even finding himself curious about it in more intimate situations. Despite his attraction to Kim Dan's calm demeanor and his hardworking nature, Jaekyung quickly pushes those feelings aside. After all, his work in MMA leaves no room for emotional distractions, and he's always lived by the rule that he can't afford liabilities in his line of work. But no matter how hard he tries to forget about Kim Dan, Jaekyung can't shake the feeling that something about the man continues to haunt him. Jaekyung's frustration grows when he sees the money Kim Dan sent him. He starts to question Kim Dan's motivations, wondering why he would send such a small amount after everything. Jaekyung's confusion leads him to drive to Kim Dan's old neighborhood, hoping to find some clue about where he's gone. But when he arrives, he realizes that Kim Dan isn't there. Feeling a sense of futility, Jaekyung questions his own actions. Why did he come here, when he knew it was a lost cause? He admits to himself that he can't just let go of Kim Dan, and the only way to clear his mind is to confront him directly. Desperate, Jaekyung calls Kim Dan's phone, but the number is no longer in service. He curses in frustration, wondering if Kim Dan is avoiding him or if something else is going on. Jaekyung's anxiety builds, and he heads to Saolim University Hospital to inquire about Kim Dan's grandmother. But the staff there informs him that she's no longer a patient. They refuse to provide any details about where she's been transferred, and Jaekyung is left in the dark. Jaekyung's search continues at other hospitals, but no one seems to know who Kim Dan is or where he's gone. At one hospital, when Jaekyung asks about him, the staff respond with confusion, mentioning that there's no physical therapist by that name on their team. Jaekyung's frustration boils over, and he runs out of the hospital, shouting in desperation, "Where the hell is he?" In a final attempt to find answers, Jaekyung calls Coach Namwook. The coach picks up and seems surprised, mentioning that Jaekyung hasn't been coming to the gym lately. Jaekyung doesn't waste any time and urgently tells the coach, "Find Doc Dan. I don't care how much it costs. Track him down by whatever means necessary. I need to see him with my own eyes."